1. A daughter is born. When I was born, people in our village commiserated with my mother, and nobody congratulated my father. I arrived at dawn as the last star blinked out. We Pashtuns see this as an auspicious sign. My father didn't have any money for the hospital or for a midwife, so a neighbor helped at my birth. My parents' first child was stillborn, but I popped out kicking and screaming. I was a girl in a land where rifles are fired in celebration of a son, while daughters are hidden away behind a curtain, their role in life simply to prepare food and give birth to children. For most Pashtuns it's a gloomy day when a daughter is born. My father's cousin Jahanshir Khan Yousafzai was one of the few who came to celebrate my birth, and even gave a handsome gift of money. Yet, he brought with him a vast family tree of our clan, the local Yousafzai, going right back to my great-great-grandfather, and showing only the male line. My father, Ziauddin, is different from most Pashtun men. He took the tree, drew a line like a lollipop from his name, and at the end of it, he wrote, Malala. His cousin laughed in astonishment. My father didn't care. He says he looked into my eyes after I was born, and fell in love. He told people, I know there is something different about this child. He even asked friends to throw dried fruits, sweets and coins into my cradle, something we usually only do for boys. I was named after Malala of Maiwand, the greatest heroine of Afghanistan. Pashtuns are a proud people of many tribes split between Pakistan and Afghanistan. We live as we have for centuries by a code called Pashtunwali, which obliges us to give hospitality to all guests, and in which the most important value is nang or honor. The worst thing that can happen to a Pashtun is loss of face. Shame is a very terrible thing for a Pashtun man. We have a saying, without honor, the world counts for nothing. We fight and feud among ourselves so much that our word for cousin Taba is the same as our word for enemy. But we always come together against outsiders who try to conquer our lands. All Pashtun children grow up with the story of how Malala inspired the Afghan army to defeat the British in 1880 in one of the biggest battles of the Second Anglo-Afghan War. Malala was the daughter of a shepherd in Maiwand, a small town on the dusty plains west of Kandahar. When she was a teenager, both her father and the man she was supposed to marry were among thousands of Afghans fighting against the British occupation of their country. Malala went to the battlefield with other women from the village to tend the wounded and take them water. She saw their men were losing, and when the flag bearer fell, she lifted her white veil up high and marched onto the battlefield in front of the troops. Young love, she shouted. If you do not fall in the Battle of Maiwand, then, by God, someone is saving you as a symbol of shame. Malala was killed under fire, but her words and bravery inspired the men to turn the battle around. They destroyed an entire brigade, one of the worst defeats in the history of the British Army. The Afghans were so proud that the last Afghan king built a Maiwand victory monument in the center of Kabul. In high school I read some Sherlock Holmes, and laughed to see that this was the same battle where Dr. Watson was wounded before becoming partner to the great detective. In Malala we Pashtuns have our very own Joan of Arc. Many girls' schools in Afghanistan are named after her. But my grandfather, who was a religious scholar and village cleric, didn't like my father giving me that name. It's a sad name, he said. It means grief-stricken. When I was a baby, my father used to sing me a song written by the famous poet Rahmat Shah Sahil of Peshawar. The last verse ends, O Malala of Maiwand, rise once more to make Pashtuns understand the song of honor, your poetic words turn worlds around, I beg you, rise again. My father told the story of Malala to anyone who came to our house. I loved hearing the story, and the songs my father sang to me, and the way my name floated on the wind when people called it. We lived in the most beautiful place in all the world. My valley, The Swat Valley is a heavenly kingdom of mountains, gushing waterfalls, and crystal-clear lakes. Welcome to paradise, it says on a sign as you enter the valley. In olden times Swat was called Adoyana, which means garden. We have fields of wild flowers, orchards of delicious fruit, emerald mines, and rivers full of trout. People often call Swat the Switzerland of the East. We even had Pakistan's first ski resort. The rich people of Pakistan came on holiday to enjoy our clean air and scenery, and our Sufi festivals of music and dancing. And so did many foreigners, all of whom we called Angras in English wherever they came from. Even the Queen of England came, and stayed in the White Palace, that was built from the same marble as the Taj Mahal by our king, the first Wali of Swat. We have a special history too. Today Swat is part of the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or KPK, as many Pakistanis call it, but Swat used to be separate from the rest of Pakistan. We were once a princely state, one of three with the neighboring lands of Chitral and Dir. In colonial times our kings owed allegiance to the British but ruled their own land. When the British gave India independence in 1947 and divided it, we went with the newly created Pakistan but stayed autonomous. We used the Pakistani rupee, but the government of Pakistan could only intervene on foreign policy. The Wali administered justice, kept the peace between warring tribes, and collected a sure tax of 10% of income, with which he built roads, hospitals, and schools. We were only 100 miles from Pakistan's capital Islamabad, as the crow flies, but it felt as if it was in another country. The journey took at least 5 hours by road over the Malakand Pass, a vast bowl of mountains where long ago our ancestors, led by a preacher called Mullah Sedula, known by the British as the Mad Fakir, battled British forces among the craggy peaks. Among them was Winston Churchill, who wrote a book about it, and we still call one of the peaks Churchill's Picket. Even though he was not very complimentary about our people. At the end of the pass is a green-domed shrine where people throw coins to give thanks for their safe arrival. No one I knew had been to Islamabad. Before the troubles came, most people, like my mother, had never been outside Swat. We lived in Mingora, the biggest town in the valley, in fact the only city. It used to be a small place, but many people had moved in from surrounding villages, making it dirty and crowded. It has hotels, colleges, a golf course, and a famous bazaar for buying our traditional embroidery, gemstones, and anything you can think of. The Margaza stream loops through it, milky brown from the plastic bags and rubbish thrown into it. It is not clear like the streams in the hilly areas or like the wide river Swat just outside town, where people fished for trout and which we visited on holidays. Our house was in Gulkada, which means place of flowers, but it used to be called Bakhara, or place of the Buddhist statues. Near our home was a field scattered with mysterious ruins, statues of lions on their haunches, broken columns, headless figures, and, oddest of all, hundreds of stone umbrellas. Islam came to our valley in the 11th century, when Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni invaded from Afghanistan, and became our ruler, but in ancient times Swat was a Buddhist kingdom. The Buddhists had arrived here in the 2nd century, and their kings ruled the valley for more than 500 years. Chinese explorers wrote stories of how there were 1,400 Buddhist monasteries along the banks of the river Swat, and the magical sound of temple bells would ring out across the valley. The temples are long gone, but almost anywhere you go in Swat, amid all the primroses and other wild flowers, you find their remains. We would often picnic among rock carvings of a smiling fat Buddha sitting cross-legged on a lotus flower. There are many stories that Lord Buddha himself came here because it is a place of such peace, and some of his ashes are said to be buried in the valley in a giant stupa. Our Bakhara ruins were a magical place to play hide and seek. Once some foreign archaeologists arrived to do some work there, and told us that in times gone by it was a place of pilgrimage, full of beautiful temples domed with gold where Buddhist kings lay buried. My father wrote a poem, The Relics of Bukhara, which summed up perfectly how temple and mosque could exist side by side, when the voice of truth rises from the minarets / the Buddha smiles / and the broken chain of history reconnects. We lived in the shadow of the Hindu Kush mountains, where the men went to shoot ibex and golden cockerels. Our house was one story, and proper concrete. On the left were steps up to a flat roof big enough for us children to play cricket on. It was our playground. At dusk my father and his friends often gathered to sit and drink tea there. Sometimes I sat on the roof too, watching the smoke rise from the cooking fires all around and listening to the nightly racket of the crickets. Our valley is full of fruit trees on which grow the sweetest figs and pomegranates and peaches, and in our garden we had grapes, guavas and persimmons. There was a plum tree in our front yard which gave the most delicious fruit. It was always a race between us and the birds to get to them. The birds loved that tree. Even the woodpeckers. For as long as I can remember my mother has talked to birds. At the back of the house was a veranda where the women gathered. We knew what it was like to be hungry, so my mother always cooked extra and gave food to poor families. If there was any left she fed it to the birds. In Pashto we loved to sing tapi, 2-line poems, and as she scattered the rice she would sing one, don't kill doves in the garden / you kill one and the others won't come. I like to sit on the roof and watch the mountains and dream. The highest mountain of all is the pyramid-shaped Mount Elam. To us it's a sacred mountain, and so high that it always wears a necklace of fleecy clouds. Even in summer it's frosted with snow. At school we learned that in 327 BC, even before the Buddhists came to Swat, Alexander the Great swept into the valley with thousands of elephants and soldiers on his way from Afghanistan to the Indus. The Swati people fled up the mountain, believing they would be protected by their gods because it was so high. But Alexander was a determined and patient leader. He built a wooden ramp from which his catapults and arrows could reach the top of the mountain. Then he climbed up so he could catch hold of the star of Jupiter as a symbol of his power. From the rooftop I watched the mountains change with the seasons. In the autumn chill winds would come. In the winter everything was white snow, long icicles hanging from the roof like daggers, which we loved to snap off. We raced around, building snowmen and snow bears, and trying to catch snowflakes. Spring was when Swat was at its greenest. Eucalyptus blossom blew into the house, coating everything white, and the wind carried the pungent smell of the rice fields. I was born in summer, which was perhaps why it was my favorite time of year, even though in Mingora summer was hot and dry, and the streams stank where people dumped their garbage. When I was born we were very poor. My father and a friend had founded their first school, and we lived in a shabby shack of 2 rooms opposite the school. I slept with my mother and father in one room, and the other was for guests. We had no bathroom or kitchen, and my mother cooked on a wood fire on the ground, and washed our clothes at a tap in the school. Our home was always full of people visiting from the village. Hospitality is an important part of Pashtun culture. 2 years after I was born my brother Kushal arrived. Like me he was born at home, as we still could not afford the hospital, and he was named Kushal like my father's school, after the Pashtun hero Kushal Khan Kotak, a warrior who was also a poet. My mother had been waiting for a son, and could not hide her joy when he was born. To me he seemed very thin and small, like a reed that could snap in the wind, but he was the apple of her eye, her ladler. It seemed to me that his every wish was her command. He wanted tea all the time, our traditional tea with milk and sugar and cardamom, but even my mother tired of this and eventually made some so bitter that he lost the taste for it. She wanted to buy a new cradle for him when I was born. My father couldn't afford one, so they used an old wooden one from the neighbors, which was already third or fourth hand, but my father refused. Malala swung in that cradle, he said. So can he. Then, nearly 5 years later, another boy was born, Atul, bright-eyed and inquisitive like a squirrel. After that, said my father, we were complete. 3 children is a small family by Swati standards, where most people have 7 or 8. I played mostly with Kushal because he was just 2 years younger than me, but we fought all the time. He would go crying to my mother, and I would go to my father. What's wrong, Yoni? He would ask. Like him, I was born double-jointed and can bend my fingers right back on themselves. And my ankles click when I walk, which makes adults squirm. My mother is very beautiful, and my father adored her as if she were a fragile china vase, never laying a hand on her, unlike many of our men. Her name Torpi Kai means raven tresses, even though her hair is chestnut brown. My grandfather, Janza Khan, had been listening to Radio Afghanistan just before she was born, and heard the name. I wished I had her white lily skin, fine features and green eyes, but instead had inherited the sallow complexion, wide nose, and brown eyes of my father. In our culture we all have nicknames aside from Pisho, which my mother had called me since I was a baby. Some of my cousins called me Lachi, which is Pashto for cardamom. Black-skinned people are often called wide and short people tall. We have a funny sense of humor. My father was known in the family as Kaista Dada, which means beautiful. When I was around 4 years old, I asked my father, Abba, what color are you? He replied, I don't know, a bit white, a bit black. It's like when one mixes milk with tea, I said. He laughed a lot, but as a boy he had been so self-conscious about being dark-skinned that he went to the fields to get buffalo milk to spread on his face, thinking it would make him lighter. It was only when he met my mother that he became comfortable in his own skin. Being loved by such a beautiful girl gave him confidence. In our society, marriages are usually arranged by families, but theirs was a love match. I could listen endlessly to the story of how they met. They came from neighboring villages in a remote valley in the upper Swat called Shangla, and would see each other when my father went to his uncle's house to study, which was next door to that of my mother's aunt. They glimpsed enough of each other to know they liked one another, but for us it is taboo to express such things. Instead he sent her poems she could not read. I admired his mind, she says. And me, her beauty, he laughs. There was one big problem. My 2 grandfathers did not get on. So when my father announced his desire to ask for the hand of my mother, Torpi Kai, it was clear neither side would welcome the marriage. His own father said it was up to him and agreed to send a barber as a messenger, which is the traditional way we Pashtuns do this. Malik Janza Khan refused the proposal, but my father is a stubborn man, and persuaded my grandfather to send the barber again. Janza Khan's hujra was a gathering place for people to talk politics, and my father was often there, so they had got to know each other. He made him wait 9 months but finally agreed. My mother comes from a family of strong women as well as influential men. Her grandmother, my great-grandmother, was widowed when her children were young, and her eldest son Janza Khan was locked up because of a tribal feud with another family when he was only 9. To get him released she walked 40 miles alone over mountains to appeal to a powerful cousin. I think my mother would do the same for us. Though she cannot read or write, my father shares everything with her, telling her about his day, the good and the bad. She teases him a lot and gives him advice about who she thinks is a genuine friend, and who is not, and my father says she is always right. Most Pashtun men never do this, as sharing problems with women is seen as weak. He even asks his wife, they say as an insult. I see my parents happy and laughing a lot. People would see us and say we are a sweet family. My mother is very pious and prays 5 times a day, though not in the mosque, as that is only for the men. She disapproves of dancing because she says God would not like it, but she loves to decorate herself with pretty things, embroidered clothes, and golden necklaces and bangles. I think I am a bit of a disappointment to her, as I am so like my father, and don't bother with clothes and jewels. I get bored going to the bazaar, but I love to dance behind closed doors with my school friends. Growing up, we children spent most of our time with our mother. My father was out a lot, as he was busy, not just with his school, but also with literary societies and jirgas, as well as trying to save the environment, trying to save our valley. My father came from a backward village, yet through education and force of personality he made a good living for us and a name for himself. People liked to hear him talk, and I loved the evenings when guests visited. We would sit on the floor around a long plastic sheet which my mother laid with food, and eat with our right hand, as is our custom, boiling together rice and meat. As darkness fell, we sat by the light of oil lamps, batting away the flies as our silhouettes made dancing shadows on the walls. In the summer months there would often be thunder and lightning crashing outside, and I would crawl closer to my father's knee. I would listen rapt as he told stories of warring tribes, Pashtun leaders and saints, often through poems that he read in a melodious voice, crying sometimes as he read. Like most people in Swat, we are from the Yousafzai tribe. We Yousafzai, which some people spell Yousafzai or Yousafzai, are originally from Kandahar and are one of the biggest Pashtun tribes, spread across Pakistan and Afghanistan. Our ancestors came to Swat in the 16th century from Kabul, where they had helped a Timurid emperor win back his throne after his own tribe removed him. The emperor rewarded them with important positions in the court and army, but his friends and relatives warned him that the Yousafzai were becoming so powerful they would overthrow him. So one night he invited all the chiefs to a banquet and set his men on them while they were eating. Around 600 chiefs were massacred. Only 2 escaped, and they fled to Peshawar along with their tribesmen. After some time they went to visit some tribes in Swat to win their support so they could return to Afghanistan. But they were so captivated by the beauty of Swat they instead decided to stay there and forced the other tribes out. The Yousafzai divided up all the land among the male members of the tribe. It was a peculiar system called Wesh, under which every 5 or 10 years all the families would swap villages and redistribute the land of the new village among the men so that everyone had the chance to work on good as well as bad land. It was thought this would then keep rival clans from fighting. Villages were ruled by Khans, and the common people, craftsmen and laborers, were their tenants. They had to pay them rent in kind, usually a share of their crop. They also had to help the Khans form a militia by providing an armed man for every small plot of land. Each Khan kept hundreds of armed men both for feuds and to raid and loot other villages. As the Yousafzai in Swat had no ruler, there were constant feuds between the Khans and even within their own families. Our men all have rifles, though these days they don't walk around with them like they do in other Pashtun areas, and my great-grandfather used to tell stories of gun battles when he was a boy. In the early part of the last century they became worried about being taken over by the British, who by then controlled most of the surrounding lands. They were also tired of the endless bloodshed. So they decided to try and find an impartial man to rule the whole area and resolve their disputes. After a couple of rulers who did not work out, in 1917 the chiefs settled on a man called Miangul Abdul Wadud as their king. We know him affectionately as Badshah Sahib, and though he was completely illiterate, he managed to bring peace to the valley. Taking a rifle away from a Pashtun is like taking away his life, so he could not disarm the tribes. Instead he built forts on mountains all across Swat and created an army. He was recognized by the British as the head of state in 1926 and installed as Wali, which is our word for ruler. He set up the first telephone system, and built the first primary school, and ended the wesh system because the constant moving between villages meant no one could sell land or had any incentive to build better houses or plant fruit trees. In 1949, 2 years after the creation of Pakistan, he abdicated in favor of his elder son Miangal Abdul Haq Jahanzeb. My father always says, while Badshah Sahib brought peace, his son brought prosperity. We think of Jahanzeb's reign as a golden period in our history. He had studied in a British school in Peshawar, and perhaps because his own father was illiterate he was passionate about schools and built many, as well as hospitals and roads. In the 1950s he ended the system where people paid taxes to the Khans. But there was no freedom of expression, and if anyone criticized the Wali, they could be expelled from the valley. In 1969, the year my father was born, the Wali gave up power, and we became part of Pakistan's northwest frontier province, which a few years ago changed its name to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So I was born a proud daughter of Pakistan, though like all Swatis I thought of myself first as Swati, and then Pashtun, before Pakistani. Near us on our street there was a family with a girl my age called Safina, and 2 boys similar in age to my brothers, Babar and Basit. We all played cricket on the street or rooftops together, but I knew as we got older the girls would be expected to stay inside. We'd be expected to cook and serve our brothers and fathers. While boys and men could roam freely about town, my mother and I could not go out without a male relative to accompany us, even if it was a 5-year-old boy. This was the tradition. I had decided very early I would not be like that. My father always said, Malala will be free as a bird. I dreamed of going to the top of Mount Ilum like Alexander the Great to touch Jupiter, and even beyond the valley. But, as I watched my brothers running across the roof, flying their kites, and skillfully flicking the strings back and forth to cut each other's down, I wondered how free a daughter could ever be. 2. My father the falcon. I always knew my father had trouble with words. Sometimes they would get stuck and he would repeat the same syllable over and over like a record caught in a groove, as we all waited for the next syllable to suddenly pop out. He said it felt like a wall came down in his throat. MS, PS and KS were all enemies lying in wait. I teased him that one of the reasons he called me Yoni was because he found it easier to say than Malala. A stutter was a terrible thing for a man who so loved words and poetry. On each side of the family he had an uncle with the same affliction. But it was almost certainly made worse by his father, whose own voice was a soaring instrument that could make words thunder and dance. Spit it out, son, he'd roar whenever my father got stuck in the middle of a sentence. My grandfather's name was Rohul Amin, which means honest spirit and is the holy name of the angel Gabriel. He was so proud of the name that he would introduce himself to people with a famous verse in which his name appears. He was an impatient man at the best of times, and would fly into a rage over the smallest thing like a hen going astray or a cup getting broken. His face would redden and he would throw kettles and pots around. I never knew my grandmother, but my father says she used to joke with my grandfather, by God, just as you greet us only with a frown, when I die may God give you a wife who never smiles. My grandmother was so worried about my father's stutter, that when he was still a young boy she took him to see a holy man. It was a long journey by bus, then an hour's walk up the hill to where he lived. Her nephew Fazli Hakim had to carry my father on his shoulders. The holy man was called Lunopur, saint of the mad, because he was said to be able to calm lunatics. When they were taken in to see the pur, he instructed my father to open his mouth, and then spat into it. Then he took some dark molasses made from sugar cane, and rolled it around his mouth to moisten it with spit. He then took out the lump and presented it to my grandmother to give to my father, a little each day. The treatment did not cure the stutter. Actually, some people thought it got worse. So when my father was 13 and told my grandfather he was entering a public speaking competition, he was stunned. "How can you?" Rohul Amin asked, laughing. "You take 1 or 2 minutes to utter just one sentence." "Don't worry," replied my father. "You write the speech and I will learn it." My grandfather was famous for his speeches. He taught theology in the government high school in the village of Sharpa. He was also an imam at the local mosque. He was a mesmerizing speaker. His sermons at Friday prayers were so popular that people would come down from the mountains by donkey or on foot to hear him. My father comes from a large family. He had one much older brother, Saeed Ramzan, who I call Uncle Khan Dada, and 5 sisters. Their village of Barkana was very primitive and they lived crammed together in a 1-story ramshackle house with a mud roof, which leaked whenever it rained or snowed. As in most families, the girls stayed at home while the boys went to school. They were just waiting to be married, says my father. School wasn't the only thing my aunts missed out on. In the morning when my father was given cream or milk, his sisters were given tea with no milk. If there were eggs, they would only be for the boys. When a chicken was slaughtered for dinner, the girls would get the wings and the neck, while the luscious breast meat was enjoyed by my father, his brother, and my grandfather. From early on I could feel I was different from my sisters, my father says. There was little to do in my father's village. It was too narrow even for a cricket pitch, and only one family had a television. On Fridays the brothers would creep into the mosque and watch in wonder as my grandfathers stood in the pulpit and preached to the congregation for an hour or so, waiting for the moment when his voice would rise and practically shake the rafters. My grandfather had studied in India, where he had seen great speakers and leaders including Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, Jawaharlal Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, our great Pashtun leader who campaigned for independence. Baba, as I called him, had even witnessed the moment of freedom from the British colonialists at midnight on the 14th of August, 1947. He had an old radio set my uncle still has, on which he loved to listen to the news. His sermons were often illustrated by world events or historical happenings, as well as stories from the Quran and the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. He also liked to talk about politics. Swat became part of Pakistan in 1969, the year my father was born. Many Swatis were unhappy about this, complaining about the Pakistani justice system, which they said was much slower and less effective than their old tribal ways. My grandfather would rail against the class system, the continuing power of the Khans, and the gap between the haves and have-nots. My country may not be very old, but unfortunately it already has a history of military coups, and when my father was 8, a general called Zia-ul-Haq seized power. There are still many pictures of him around. He was a scary man with dark panda shadows around his eyes, large teeth that seemed to stand to attention, and hair pomaded flat on his head. He arrested our elected Prime Minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and had him tried for treason, then hanged from a scaffold in Rawalpindi jail. Even today people talk of Mr. Bhutto as a man of great charisma. They say he was the first Pakistani leader to stand up for the common people, though he himself was a feudal lord with vast estates of mango fields. His execution shocked everybody and made Pakistan look bad all around the world. The Americans cut off aid. To try to get people at home to support him, General Zia launched a campaign of Islamization to make us a proper Muslim country, with the army as the defenders of our country's ideological as well as geographical frontiers. He told our people it was their duty to obey his government because it was pursuing Islamic principles. Zia even wanted to dictate how we should pray, and set up salat or prayer committees in every district, even in our remote village, and appointed 100,000 prayer inspectors. Before then mullahs had almost been figures of fun, my father said, at wedding parties. They would just hang around in a corner, and leave early, but under Zia they became influential, and were called to Islamabad for guidance on sermons. Even my grandfather went. Under Zia's regime, life for women in Pakistan became much more restricted. Jinnah said, no struggle can ever succeed without women participating side by side with men. There are two powers in the world, one is the sword and the other is the pen. There is a third power stronger than both, that of women. But General Zia brought in Islamic laws, which reduced a woman's evidence in court to count for only half that of a man's. Soon our prisons were full of cases like that of a 13-year-old girl who was raped and become pregnant and was then sent to prison for adultery because she couldn't produce 4 male witnesses to prove it was a crime. A woman couldn't even open a bank account without a man's permission. As a nation we have always been good at hockey, but Zia made our female hockey players wear baggy trousers instead of shorts, and stopped women playing some sports altogether. Many of our madrasas or religious schools were opened at that time, and in all schools religious studies, what we call Diniyat, was replaced by Islamiyat, or Islamic studies, which children in Pakistan still have to do today. Our history textbooks were rewritten to describe Pakistan as a fortress of Islam, which made it seem as if we had existed far longer than since 1947, and denounced Hindus and Jews. Anyone reading them might think we won the 3 wars we have fought and lost against our great enemy India. Everything changed when my father was 10. Just after Christmas 1979 the Russians invaded our neighbor Afghanistan. Millions of Afghans fled across the border, and General Zia gave them refuge. Vast camps of white tents sprang up mostly around Peshawar, some of which are still there today. Our biggest intelligence service belongs to the military and is called the ISI. It started a massive program to train Afghan refugees recruited from the camps as resistance fighters or mujahideen. Though Afghans are renowned fighters, Colonel Imam, the officer heading the program, complained that trying to organize them was like weighing frogs. The Russian invasion transformed Zia from an international pariah to the great defender of freedom in the Cold War. The Americans became friends with us once again, as in those days Russia was their main enemy. Next door to us the Shah of Iran had been overthrown in a revolution a few months earlier, so the CIA had lost their main base in the region. Pakistan took its place. Billions of dollars flowed into our exchequer from the United States and other Western countries, as well as weapons to help the ISI train the Afghans to fight the Communist Red Army. General Zia was invited to meet President Ronald Reagan at the White House and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at 10 Downing Street. They lavished praise on him. Prime Minister Zulfikar Bhutto had appointed Zia as his army chief because he thought he was not very intelligent and would not be a threat. He called him his monkey. But Zia turned out to be a very wily man. He made Afghanistan a rallying point not only for the West, which wanted to stop the spread of communism from the Soviet Union, but also for Muslims from Sudan to Tajikistan, who saw it as a fellow Islamic country under attack from infidels. Money poured in from all over the Arab world, particularly Saudi Arabia, which matched whatever the US sent, and volunteer fighters too, including a Saudi millionaire called Osama bin Laden. We Pashtuns are split between Pakistan and Afghanistan and don't really recognize the border that the British drew more than 100 years ago. So our blood boiled over the Soviet invasion for both religious and nationalist reasons. The clerics of the mosques would often talk about the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in their sermons, condemning the Russians as infidels and urging people to join the jihad, saying it was their duty as good Muslims. It was as if under Zia jihad had become the Sixth pillar of our religion. On top of the 5 we grow up to learn the belief in one God, namaz or prayers 5 times a day, giving zakat or alms, rosa fasting from dawn till sunset during the month of Ramadan, and Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, which every able-bodied Muslim should do once in their lifetime. My father says that in our part of the world, this idea of jihad was very much encouraged by the CIA. Children in the refugee camps were even given school textbooks produced by an American university, which taught basic arithmetic through fighting. They had examples like, if out of 10 Russian infidels, 5 are killed by one Muslim, 5 would be left, or 15 bullets, 10 bullets equals 5 bullets. Some boys from my father's district went off to fight in Afghanistan. My father remembers that one day a Maulana called Sufi Muhammad came to the village and asked young men to join him to fight the Russians in the name of Islam. Many did, and they set off, armed with old rifles or just axes and bazookas. Little did we know that years later the same Maulana's organization would become the Swat Taliban. At that time my father was only 12 years old and too young to fight. But the Russians ended up stuck in Afghanistan for 10 years, through most of the 1980s, and when he became a teenager my father decided he too wanted to be a jihadi. Though later he became less regular in his prayers, in those days he used to leave home at dawn every morning to walk to a mosque in another village, where he studied the Quran with a senior talib. At that time talib simply meant religious student. Together they studied all the 30 chapters of the Quran, not just recitation but also interpretation, something few boys do. The Talib talked of jihad in such glorious terms that my father was captivated. He would endlessly point out to my father that life on earth was short and that there were few opportunities for young men in the village. Our family owned little land, and my father did not want to end up going south to work in the coal mines like many of his classmates. That was tough and dangerous work, and the coffins of those killed in accidents would come back several times a year. The best that most village boys could hope for was to go to Saudi Arabia or Dubai and work in construction. So heaven with its 72 virgins sounded attractive. Every night my father would pray to God, "Oh Allah, please make war between Muslims and infidels so I can die in your service and be a martyr." For a while his Muslim identity seemed more important than anything else in his life. He began to sign himself Ziauddin Panchpiri. The Panchpiri are a religious sect, and sprouted the first signs of a beard. It was, he says, a kind of brainwashing. He believes he might even have thought of becoming a suicide bomber had there been such a thing in those days. But from an early age he had been a questioning kind of boy who rarely took anything at face value, even though our education at government schools meant learning by rote, and pupils were not supposed to question teachers. It was around the time he was praying to go to heaven as a martyr that he met my mother's brother, Faiz Mohammed, and started mixing with her family and going to her father's hujra. They were very involved in local politics, belonged to secular nationalist parties, and were against involvement in the war. A famous poem was written at that time by Rahmat Shah Sail, the same Peshawar poet who wrote the poem about my namesake. He described what was happening in Afghanistan as a war between two elephants, the US and the Soviet Union, not our war, and said that we Pashtuns were like the grass crushed by the hooves of two fierce beasts. My father often used to recite the poem to me when I was a child, but I didn't know then what it meant. My father was very impressed by Faiz Mohammed and thought he talked a lot of sense, particularly about wanting to end the feudal and capitalist systems in our country, where the same big families had controlled things for years while the poor got poorer. He found himself torn between the two extremes, secularism and socialism on one side, and militant Islam on the other. I guess he ended up somewhere in the middle. My father was in awe of my grandfather, and told me wonderful stories about him, but he also told me that he was a man who could not meet the high standards he set for others. Baba was such a popular and passionate speaker that he could have been a great leader if he had been more diplomatic and less consumed by rivalries with cousins and others who were better off. In Pashtun society, it is very hard to stomach a cousin being more popular, wealthier or more influential than you are. My grandfather had a cousin who also joined his school as a teacher. When he got the job, he gave his age as much younger than my grandfather. Our people don't know their exact dates of birth. My mother, for example, does not know when she was born. We tend to remember years by events, like an earthquake. But my grandfather knew that his cousin was actually much older than him. He was so angry that he made the day-long bus journey to Mingora to see the Swat Minister of Education. Sahib, he told him, I have a cousin who is 10 years older than me and you have certified him 10 years younger. So the minister said, okay, Maulana, what shall I write down for you? Would you like to have been born in the year of the earthquake of Quetta? My grandfather agreed, so his new date of birth became 1935, making him much younger than his cousin. This family rivalry meant that my father was bullied a lot by his cousins. They knew he was insecure about his looks because at school the teachers always favored the handsome boys for their fair skin. His cousins would stop my father on his way home from school and tease him about being short and dark-skinned. In our society you have to take revenge for such slights, but my father was much smaller than his cousins. He also felt he could never do enough to please my grandfather. Baba had beautiful handwriting, and my father would spend hours painstakingly drawing letters, but Baba never once praised him. My grandmother kept his spirits up. He was her favorite, and she believed great things lay in store for him. She loved him so much that she would slip him extra meat and the cream of the milk while she went without. But it wasn't easy to study as there was no electricity in the village in those days. He used to read by the light of the oil lamp in the hujra, and one evening he went to sleep and the oil lamp fell over. Fortunately my grandmother found him before a fire started. It was my grandmother's faith in my father that gave him the courage to find his own proud path he could travel along. This is the path that he would later show me. Yet she too got angry with him once. Holy men from a spiritual place called Dere-I-Sadan used to travel the villages in those days begging for flour. One day while his parents were out, some of them came to the house. My father broke the seal on the wooden storage box of maize and filled their bowls. When my grandparents came home they were furious and beat him. Pashtuns are famously frugal, though generous with guests, and Baba was particularly careful with money. If any of his children accidentally spilled their food, he would fly into a rage. He was an extremely disciplined man, and could not understand why they were not the same. As a teacher he was eligible for a discount on his son's school fees for sports and joining the Boy Scouts. It was such a small discount that most teachers did not bother, but he forced my father to apply for the rebate. Of course my father detested doing this. As he waited outside the headmaster's office, he broke out into a sweat, and once inside his stutter was worse than ever. It felt as if my honor was at stake for 5 rupees, he told me. My grandfather never bought him new books. Instead he would tell his best students to keep their old books for my father at the end of the year, and then he would be sent to their homes to get them. He felt ashamed but had no choice if he didn't want to end up illiterate. All his books were inscribed with other boys' names, never his own. It's not that passing books on is a bad practice, he says. It's just I so wanted a new book, unmarked by another student, and bought with my father's money. My father's dislike of Baba's frugality has made him a very generous man, both materially and in spirit. He became determined to end the traditional rivalry between him and his cousins. When his headmaster's wife fell ill, my father donated blood to help save her. The man was astonished and apologized for having tormented him. When my father tells me stories of his childhood, he always says that though Baba was a difficult man, he gave him the most important gift, the gift of education. He sent my father to the government high school to learn English and receive a modern education rather than to a madrasa, even though as an imam people criticized him for this. Baba also gave him a deep love of learning and knowledge as well as a keen awareness of people's rights, which my father has passed on to me. In my grandfather's Friday addresses, he would talk about the poor and the landowners, and how true Islam is against feudalism. He also spoke Persian and Arabic and cared deeply for words. He read the great poems of Sa'di, Allama Iqbal and Rumi to my father with such passion and fire it was as if he was teaching the whole mosque. My father longed to be eloquent with a voice that boomed out with no stammer, and he knew my grandfather desperately wanted him to be a doctor, but though he was a very bright student and a gifted poet, he was poor at maths and science, and felt he was a disappointment. That's why he decided he would make his father proud by entering the district's annual public speaking competition. Everyone thought he was mad. His teachers and friends tried to dissuade him, and his father was reluctant to write the speech for him. But eventually Baba gave him a fine speech, which my father practiced and practiced. He committed every word to memory while walking in the hills, reciting it to the skies and birds, as there was no privacy in their home. There was not much to do in the area where they lived, so when the day arrived there was a huge gathering. Other boys, some known as good speakers, gave their speeches. Finally my father was called forward. I stood at the lectern, he told me, hands shaking and knees knocking, so short I could barely see over the top, and so terrified the faces were a blur. My palms were sweating and my mouth was as dry as paper. He tried desperately not to think about the treacherous consonants lying ahead of him, just waiting to trip him up and stick in his throat, but when he spoke, the words came out fluently like beautiful butterflies taking flight. His voice did not boom like his father's, but his passion shone through, and as he went on he gained confidence. At the end of the speech there were cheers and applause. Best of all, as he went up to collect the cup for first prize, he saw his father clapping and enjoying being patted on the back by those standing around him. It was, he says, the first thing I'd done that made him smile. After that my father entered every competition in the district. My grandfather wrote his speeches, and he almost always came first, gaining a reputation locally as an impressive speaker. My father had turned his weakness into strength. For the first time Baba started praising him in front of others. He'd boast, Ziauddin is a Shaheen, a falcon, because this is a creature that flies high above other birds. Write your name as Ziauddin Shaheen, he told him. For a while my father did this but stopped. When he realized that although a falcon flies high it is a cruel bird. Instead he just called himself Malala Yousafzai, our clan name. 3. Growing up in a school. My mother started school when she was 6 and stopped the same term. She was unusual in the village, as she had a father and brothers who encouraged her to go to school. She was the only girl in a class of boys. She carried her bag of books proudly into school, and claims she was brighter than the boys. But every day she would leave behind her girl cousins playing at home, and she envied them. There seemed no point in going to school just to end up cooking, cleaning and bringing up children, so one day she sold her books for 9 annas, spent the money on boiled sweets, and never went back. Her father said nothing. She says he didn't even notice, as he would set off early every morning after a breakfast of cornbread and cream, his German pistol strapped under his arm, and spend his days busy with local politics or resolving feuds. Besides, he had 7 other children to think about. It was only when she met my father that she felt regret. Here was a man who had read so many books, who wrote her poems she could not read, and whose ambition was to have his own school. As his wife, she wanted to help him achieve that. For as long as my father could remember, it had been his dream to open a school, but with no family contacts or money, it was extremely hard for him to realize this dream. He thought there was nothing more important than knowledge. He remembered how mystified he had been by the river in his village, wondering where the water came from and went to, until he learned about the water cycle from the rain to the sea. His own village school had been just a small building. Many of his classes were taught under a tree on the bare ground. There were no toilets, and the pupils went to the fields to answer the call of nature. Yet he says he was actually lucky. His sisters, my aunts, did not go to school at all, just like millions of girls in my country. Education had been a great gift for him. He believed that lack of education was the root of all Pakistan's problems. Ignorance allowed politicians to fool people and bad administrators to be re-elected. He believed schooling should be available for all, rich and poor, boys and girls. The school that my father dreamed of would have desks and a library, computers, bright posters on the walls, and, most important, washrooms. My grandfather had a different dream for his youngest son. He longed for him to be a doctor, and as one of just 2 sons, he expected him to contribute to the household budget. My father's elder brother Saeed Ramzan had worked for years as a teacher at a local school. He and his family lived with my grandfather, and whenever he saved up enough of his salary, they built a small concrete hujra at the side of the house for guests. He brought logs back from the mountains for firewood, and after teaching he would work in the fields where our family had a few buffaloes. He also helped Baba with heavy tasks like clearing snow from the roof. When my father was offered a place for his A-levels at Jahanzeb College, which is the best further education institution in Swat, my grandfather refused to pay for his living expenses. His own education in Delhi had been free. He had lived like a talib in the mosques, and local people had provided the students with food and clothes. Tuition at Jahanzeb was free, but my father needed money to live on. Pakistan doesn't have student loans, and he had never even set foot in a bank. The college was in Seju Sharif, the twin town of Mingora, and he had no family there with whom he could stay. There was no other college in Shangla, and if he didn't go to college, he would never be able to move out of the village and realize his dream. My father was at his wits' end, and wept with frustration. His beloved mother had died just before he graduated from school. He knew if she had been alive, she would have been on his side. He pleaded with his father, but to no avail. His only hope was his brother-in-law in Karachi. My grandfather suggested that he might take my father in so he could go to college there. The couple would soon be arriving in the village, as they were coming to offer condolences after my grandmother's death. My father prayed they would agree, but my grandfather asked them as soon as they arrived, exhausted after the 3-day bus journey, and his son-in-law refused outright. My grandfather was so furious he would not speak to them for their entire stay. My father felt he had lost his chance, and would end up like his brother teaching in a local school. The school where Uncle Khan Dada taught was in the mountain village of Swat, about an hour and a half's climb from their house. It didn't even have its own building. They used the big hall in the mosque, where they taught more than 100 children ranging from 5 to 15 years old. The people in Swat were Gujars, Kahisnis and Mians. We regard Mians as noble or landed people, but Gujars and Kahisnis are what we call hilly people, peasants who look after buffaloes. Their children are usually dirty, and they are looked down upon by Pashtuns, even if they are poor themselves. They are dirty, black and stupid, people would say. Let them be illiterate. It is often said that teachers don't like to be posted to such remote schools, and generally make a deal with their colleagues so that only one of them has to go to work each day. If the school has 2 teachers, each goes in for 3 days and signs the other in. If it has 3 teachers, each goes in for just 2 days. Once there, all they do is keep the children quiet with a long stick, as they cannot imagine education will be any use to them.